The mountain lion died slowly, which was merciful. Its amber eyes dimmed as dawn light broke across the canyon rim, turning the sandstone walls from charcoal to rust. Tsei Nalnish knelt beside the massive body, her blade still warm with blood. She was 32 years old, though the desert had carved lines into her face that made her appear both younger and impossibly ancient at the same time. The kill had been clean. One strike to the throat, severing the artery before the animal could understand what had happened. Tsei placed her palm against the lion's cooling flank, feeling the final tremors of muscle memory beneath the fur. She whispered words in Apache words her grandmother had taught her, words that thanked the animal for its strength and asked its spirit to guide her through the darkness ahead. Then she drew her knife again and opened the lion's belly. The liver came out steaming in the cold morning air. Tsei held it in both hands, studying the dark purple tissue for signs of disease or weakness. Finding none, she brought it to her mouth and bit down. The flesh was warm and metallic, tasting of copper and wild sage. She chewed slowly, deliberately, swallowing the lion's courage along with its meat. This was the old way. This was how Apache women had honored their prey for centuries, taking strength from what they killed, giving respect in return. Blood ran down her chin and dripped onto the red earth. She wiped her mouth with the back of her hand, then began the work of skinning. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, separating hide from muscle from bone. The sun climbed higher, transforming Shadow Valley from a landscape of shadows into something luminous and alive. Somewhere far below, water moved through hidden channels. Birds called to one another in languages she had learned as a child. The world continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human grief or human rage. Tsei worked in silence, her mind empty of thought. This was meditation. This was prayer. The repetitive motion of the blade, the steady separation of what was useful from what must be returned to the earth. She had learned this from her husband, Daklugi, who had learned it from his father, who had learned it from warriors who fought the Spanish before the Americans ever arrived. Daklugi was dead now. 3 years in the ground, killed by smallpox that came north with the railroad workers. The disease had spread through their small community like wildfire through dry grass. 15 people dead in 2 months, among them their son, 7 years old with his father's serious eyes and his mother's stubborn chin. Naiche. His name had been Naiche. Tsei paused in her work, the knife hanging loose in her grip. For a moment the world tilted sideways. She could see her son's face superimposed on the canyon wall, laughing as he ran through the mesquite trees chasing rabbits he would never catch. She could hear his voice calling for her high and bright and full of absolute trust that his mother could fix anything, heal anything, make the world safe again. But she had not been able to fix him. She had tried every medicine her grandmother had taught her. She had mixed poultices from sacred plants, had sung healing songs over his fevered body, had bargained with spirits both friendly and hostile. Nothing had worked. In the end he had died in her arms, his skin covered in pustules, his small body racked with convulsions. The knife slipped in her hand, cutting deep into her palm. Tsei looked down at the wound with distant interest. Blood welled up, mixing with the lion's blood already coating her skin. She wrapped a strip of leather around her hand and returned to work. Pain was irrelevant. Pain was simply information telling her body that it still functioned, that it had not yet joined her son in the dark earth. By the time she finished, the sun stood directly overhead. The lion's hide lay folded beside her, a gift that would become winter clothing or trade goods. The meat she would dry into jerky enough to last through the coming months. The bones she had already arranged in a specific pattern, a blessing and a warning to other predators. This canyon belonged to those who could defend it. Tsei gathered her materials and began the long walk back to Shadow Valley proper. She moved through terrain that would have killed most people, navigating paths only she remembered. Here a narrow ledge above a 60-foot drop. There a crack in the rock face barely wide enough for human shoulders. The Apache had survived in this landscape for generations, precisely because they knew its secrets could disappear into geography the way smoke disappears into air. The wickiup came into view as she rounded the final bend. It sat beside a spring that never ran dry even in the worst droughts. The structure was traditional, built from bent saplings covered in canvas and hide, designed to be taken down and moved quickly if necessary. Around it, she had created a small world, drying racks for meat, a fire pit lined with stones, pottery vessels for storing water and grain. This had been her home for 15 years, longer than any place she had ever lived. After the government had forced most Apache people onto reservations, her grandfather had negotiated to keep this one small parcel of land. 500 acres in a box canyon so remote that the cavalry had never bothered to map it properly. The officials in Washington had agreed because the land seemed worthless, too rocky for farming, too isolated for ranching, too difficult to access for any kind of development. They had been wrong about its value, but right about its isolation. Tsei hung the lion hide on a drying rack and began washing the blood from her hands and arms. The water from the spring ran cold and clear, tasting faintly of minerals. She cupped her hands and drank deeply, then splashed water on her face. When she looked up, 3 men stood watching her from across the clearing. She had not heard them approach. This was unusual enough to be alarming. Tsei's hand moved slowly toward the knife at her hip, but she did not draw it. Not yet. The men wore white men's clothing, dark trousers, vests over cotton shirts, boots caked with red dust. They carried equipment she did not recognize, metal instruments that caught the sunlight and threw it back in painful flashes. The tallest man stepped forward, removing his hat in what he probably thought was a gesture of respect. He was young, perhaps 25, with pale skin already burning pink under the Arizona sun. When he spoke, his voice carried the careful pronunciation of someone who had practiced this conversation. "Ma'am, we don't mean to trespass. We're surveyors working for the Arizona Copper and Land Company. We have authorization from the territorial government to map this region." Tsei said nothing. She simply looked at him, her face empty of expression. The Apache had learned long ago that silence made white men uncomfortable. They would rush to fill the quiet with more words, and in those words they would reveal their true intentions. The young surveyor shifted his weight from foot to foot. "We're just making measurements, recording topographical information. Standard practice before any kind of development project. Nothing for you to worry about." Development project. The words hung in the air like smoke signals, carrying meanings the surveyor probably did not understand. Tsei had heard these words before. They meant roads and mines and towns. They meant the end of everything. She stood slowly, water dripping from her hands. Without taking her eyes from the 3 men, she walked past them toward a flat rock where she had left her rifle that morning. The surveyors tensed, but she did not reach for the weapon. Instead, she sat down on the rock, positioning herself so the rifle was within easy reach, and continued to stare at them in absolute silence. The young surveyor looked at his companion's confusion evident on his sunburned face. The second man, older and harder, leaned close and whispered something. Tsei could not hear the words, but she understood their meaning. They were deciding whether she was dangerous or simply strange, whether they should continue working or report back to their employers. The third man, who had not spoken, was the one who made the decision. He was middle-aged, with gray threading through dark hair and eyes that had seen things he would rather forget. He put a hand on the young surveyor's shoulder and shook his head slightly. Then he looked directly at Tsei, and in that look there was recognition. He had fought in the Indian Wars. He knew what he was seeing. The 3 men began packing their equipment with exaggerated care, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid any gesture that might be interpreted as threatening. Tsei watched them work, still silent, still motionless. When they finished, the older man tipped his hat to her, and the young surveyor stammered out an apology that she did not acknowledge. They left the way they had come, following the narrow path that led out of the canyon. Tsei waited until they disappeared from sight, then counted to 100 in Apache before moving. When she was certain they were gone, she walked to where they had been standing and knelt down. They had dropped something in their hurry to leave. It was a map, hand-drawn on heavy paper, already curling at the edges in the dry air. Tseyi unfolded it carefully, studying the lines and symbols. She could read English, though she rarely admitted this to white people. Her mother had insisted she attend the mission school for 3 years, believing that knowledge of the enemy's language would protect her daughter in the world that was coming. The map showed Shadow Valley in precise detail. Every spring, every canyon, every place where the rock formations created natural defenses. But what caught Sei's attention were the markings scattered across the drawing, small crosses with numbers beside them. She did not understand all the technical annotations, but she understood the number at the bottom of the page. $2 million. That was the estimated value of the copper deposits beneath Shadow Valley, beneath her home, beneath the graves of her husband and son. Sei held the map over the fire pit and watched it burn. The paper blackened and curled, transforming detailed measurements into ash. But burning the map would not burn the knowledge it represented. The copper was still there, still worth $2 million to people who saw the earth as nothing more than something to be bought and sold. She knew what would happen next. They would come with lawyers and false treaties. They would come with soldiers and guns. They would come with diseases and whiskey and promises that evaporated like morning dew. This was the pattern. This was how the Apache had lost everything else. Why would Shadow Valley be any different? Night fell quickly in the canyon the way it always did. One moment the sky was purple with twilight. The next stars emerged in their thousands, so bright they seemed close enough to touch. Sei sat beside her fire and did not sleep. Instead, she thought about her son. Naiche had been born in this canyon. She had labored for 18 hours in the wickiup, attended by her grandmother and 2 other women who knew the old songs. When he finally emerged, blood-slick and screaming, the sun had been setting exactly as it was setting, now painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose. He had been beautiful. All babies were beautiful, but her son had possessed something extra, a light that seemed to come from inside him. Even as an infant, he had looked at the world with such fierce curiosity, such absolute trust that the universe would reveal its secrets to him. Sei had taught him everything she knew. How to find water by watching where birds flew at dawn, how to move through the desert without leaving tracks, how to read the stories written in animal scat and broken twigs, how to sit so still that deer would graze within arm's reach, unaware they were being observed. She had taught him the language of their people, even though speaking Apache was forbidden on the reservation. She had taught him the songs his grandmother had taught her, songs that called rain and blessed hunts and mourned the dead. She had taught him that he was Apache, that he came from warriors and healers, that his ancestors had held this land for more generations than anyone could count. And then the smallpox had come. The memory surfaced like something rising from deep water, too heavy to push back down. Naiche lying on a blanket, his small body trembling with fever, his skin erupting in pustules that wept clear fluid, his breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Sei had tried everything. She had made him drink teas brewed from sacred plants. She had wrapped him in blankets soaked in cold water. She had sung healing songs until her voice broke and blood appeared on her lips. Nothing had helped. In the end, he had looked up at her with eyes that still trusted her completely, that believed his mother could fix this the way she fixed everything else. And then he had died. Just stopped breathing, as simply as that. One moment he was alive, struggling. The next he was gone. Sei had not cried. Not then, not at the burial, not in the 3 years since. Apache women were taught to be strong, to endure, to carry grief the way the earth carried mountains. But sometimes in moments like this, sitting alone under stars, her son would never see. She wondered if that strength was real or simply another kind of death. She stood and walked to the edge of the clearing where a circle of stones marked the grave. Daklugie was buried there too, beside his son. Sei had placed them together so they would not be alone in the darkness. She had given them her best blankets, her finest pottery, all the things the dead might need for their journey. Now she knelt between the 2 graves and placed her hands flat on the earth. "I made you a promise," she said in Apache. "I told you I would not let them take this place. I told you that you would rest here forever, that no one would disturb your sleep. I meant it then. I mean it now." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and juniper down from the higher elevations. Somewhere in the darkness a coyote called. The sound was lonely and defiant, a creature announcing its presence to a world that wanted it gone. Tsei understood that feeling. She returned to her fire and began preparing for what was coming. From a leather bag hidden in her wickiup, she withdrew items she had not touched in years. A medicine pouch her grandmother had given her filled with herbs and stones and things that had power. A necklace of bear claws that had belonged to her great-grandfather, a warrior who had fought the Spanish and won. A small clay pot containing paint made from red ochre and animal fat. She stripped to the waist and began painting her face and arms. The patterns were traditional symbols of protection and strength. As she worked, she sang quietly songs her grandmother had taught her, songs that were older than the canyon itself. The paint was cold against her skin, but she welcomed the sensation. It was real. It was preparation. It was a promise made visible. When she finished, she looked down at her hands. They were steady. Good. She would need steady hands for what was coming. Movement at the edge of the clearing made her reach for her rifle, but she relaxed when she recognized the figure emerging from the shadows. It was not a threat. Not yet, anyway. The girl was young, perhaps 19, with long dark hair and eyes that reflected firelight like a nocturnal animal. She wore a calico dress in the white style already dusty from travel. She stood at the edge of the firelight, uncertain like a deer deciding whether to bolt. Tsei knew who she was. This was Nijoni, daughter of Tsei's younger brother Mangas. The girl had been raised away from the tribe, living on the San Carlos reservation with her mother, who was white. Tsei had not seen her niece in over a decade, not since Mangas had died fighting cavalry soldiers who were chasing Apache families trying to escape to Mexico. "Aunt Tsei," the girl said in English, her voice barely above a whisper. Tsei did not respond immediately. She studied her niece the way she would study an animal whose behavior she needed to understand. The girl's posture was wrong, too open, too vulnerable. Her hands twisted together nervously. Her eyes kept darting away from direct contact. This was someone who had been taught to make herself small to apologize for existing. "You should not be here," Tsei finally said in Apache. "I had nowhere else to go," Nijoni replied, switching to her father's language with obvious difficulty. The words came out awkward, unpracticed. "My mother died. The consumption. There is no one left at San Carlos who will take me in. So you came to me. You are my family, my father's sister. Your father died defending people who would spit on you if they knew you were his daughter." The words were harsh, but Tsei's voice remained neutral, simply stating facts. "What makes you think I will do better?" Nijoni flinched as if struck, but she did not retreat. Instead, she took a step forward into the full light of the fire. "Because you are still here. Everyone else left or died or gave up. But you stayed. That means something." Tsei considered this. The girl was right, though perhaps not in the way she imagined. Staying did mean something. It meant choosing this place over safety, over comfort, over the possibility of a life that did not involve constant struggle. It meant deciding that some things were worth dying for. "Are you prepared to die?" Tsei asked. The question hung in the air between them, too large and too honest for the kind of conversation young people usually had with their elders. Nijoni's eyes widened, but to her credit she did not pretend to misunderstand. "I do not know," she said finally. "I have never thought about it." "Then you should leave. Tomorrow, when it is light, you should walk back to San Carlos. Find someone who will take you to Phoenix or Tucson. Learn to sew or clean houses. Marry a man who works for the railroad. Have children who will never know they are Apache. Live. Is that what you want me to do?" Tsei looked into the fire, watching flames transform wood into light and heat and ash. "What I want does not matter. The world does not care what Apache women want. It never has." Nijoni was quiet for a long moment. Then she sat down across the fire uninvited and began unlacing her boots. They were white women's boots, impractical for canyon life already splitting at the seams. She removed them carefully and set them aside. "My father told me stories about you," she said, "before he died. He said you were the strongest woman he ever knew, stronger than the warriors, stronger than the chiefs. He said you survived things that would have killed anyone else. Your father was kind. Kindness makes people see things that are not there. He said you killed a mountain lion with nothing but a knife when you were 16 years old. Tsei glanced up, surprised despite herself. He remembered that. He said it was the day he understood you would never be like other women, that you would never accept what the white men said Apache people had to accept. A memory surfaced sharp and bright. Tsei, at 16, already married to Daklugie, already pregnant with the child who would become Naiche. A lion had killed 2 of their horses and the men had gone to hunt it with rifles. But Tsei had tracked it alone, following signs invisible to anyone else. She had found it sleeping in a cave and had crawled inside with nothing but a blade and absolute certainty. The fight had lasted less than a minute. The lion had woken too late, confused by the human scent in its den. Tsei had driven her knife into its throat before it could coordinate an attack. She had emerged from the cave covered in blood, dragging the lion's body behind her. The warriors had been impressed. The women had been horrified. Daklugie had laughed and said he had married a woman who made other men look like children. I killed it because it killed something that belonged to me, Tsei said. That is all. There is no philosophy in it, no deeper meaning. It took what was mine. I took its life in return. And now, Nijoni asked, what will you do now that white men are coming to take what is yours? Before Tsei could answer, the sound of horses reached them. Multiple riders moving quickly despite the darkness. This was unusual. No one rode through canyon country at night unless they were running from something or chasing something. Tsei rose smoothly, reaching for her rifle. Nijoni scrambled to her feet, fear evident on her face. The riders emerged into the clearing moments later, 5 men on horseback, their faces hidden by shadow and dust. They wore dark clothes and carried themselves with the confident brutality of men who had hurt people before and expected to do so again. The lead rider dismounted with practiced ease, his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. When he stepped into the firelight, Tsei could see he was young, perhaps 30, with hard eyes and a smile that did not reach them. "Evening, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the lazy drawl of someone from further east. "Name's Pike. I work for the Arizona Copper and Land Company. My associates and I are here to deliver a message from our employers." Tsei said nothing. She simply looked at him, her rifle held loosely but ready. Pike's smile widened, as if her silence confirmed something he had already suspected. "You see, there's been a misunderstanding. This land you're living on, it doesn't actually belong to you. It belongs to the Arizona Copper Company, has for about 4 years now. There was a legal transfer of ownership back in 1888. All proper and recorded." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, holding it up so the firelight illuminated official-looking seals and signatures. "This here is the deed signed by a representative of your people, fellow named Victorio Chato. I am sure you know him." Tsei knew the name. Victorio Chato had been a warrior, one of the last to surrender after Geronimo. He had been captured and imprisoned, then released under conditions she did not know, but she had heard he was dead. She had heard he died in prison before the supposed transfer of ownership. "Victorio Chato is dead," she said, speaking English for the first time. Pike's smile did not falter. "Well, according to this document, he was alive enough to sign over the mineral and land rights to Shadow Valley in exchange for his freedom and a small monetary settlement. All legal, all binding." "Legal," Tsei repeated, tasting the word like poison. "White men's legal, which means it is built on lies. Now, ma'am, that is a serious accusation. My employers are prepared to be generous. They are willing to offer you compensation for leaving peacefully. $200 paid immediately and safe passage to whichever reservation you prefer. $200. For land worth $2 million, for the graves of her husband and son, for the only place she had ever belonged." Tsei laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, more like a bark than human laughter. Pike's expression hardened, the false friendliness evaporating like morning dew. "I would encourage you to reconsider," he said, his voice dropping into a register that carried clear threat. "My employers are patient men, but their patience has limits. If you refuse this generous offer, well, accidents happen out here. Fires, animal attacks, people just disappearing. It would be a shame if something unfortunate occurred." He signaled to his men, who began pulling items from their saddlebags. Wooden stakes, long and painted white. They moved through the clearing with practiced efficiency, driving the stakes into the ground at regular intervals. When they finished, 5 stakes formed a rough perimeter around the wickiup and the spring. Each stake bore painted letters: "Private property, Arizona Copper Company, trespassers will be shot." Then, without warning, one of the men raised his rifle and shot Tsei's cow. The animal had been grazing peacefully at the edge of the clearing. It dropped instantly dead before it understood what was happening. The sound of the gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, multiplying until it seemed like an entire battle was being fought in the darkness. The man shot 2 more cows before Pike held up his hand. The animals lay in spreading pools of blood, their eyes still open, reflecting starlight. "A demonstration," Pike said calmly, "of what happens when our property is damaged by trespassers. Consider it a warning, ma'am. Next time we might not be so discriminating about our targets." He remounted his horse with the same practiced ease he had dismounted. His men followed suit, moving as a coordinated unit. Before they left, Pike tipped his hat in a gesture of mock courtesy. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, we will not be responsible for what happens to anyone found on company land." They rode away into darkness, leaving behind their stakes and their dead animals and the stench of gunpowder mixing with blood. Nijoni stood frozen, her hand pressed against her mouth as if holding back a scream. Tsei walked slowly to the nearest dead cow and knelt beside it. The animal had been with her for 5 years, had produced 2 calves, had been gentle and reliable. Now it was meat and hide, killed for no reason except to prove that Pike and his employers could kill whenever they wished. She placed her hand on the cow's flank, feeling the fading warmth. Then she stood and walked back to her fire. From her medicine bag she withdrew a small knife different from the hunting blade. This one was ceremonial, used only for sacred purposes. Without hesitation, Tsei gathered a length of her own hair and cut it off close to her scalp. The hair fell into the fire, hissing and smoking as it burned. This was Apache tradition before battle, a way of marking the transition from peace to war, from one state of being to another. "Aunt Tsei," Nijoni said, her voice shaking. "What are you doing?" Tsei did not answer immediately. She cut another section of hair and fed it to the flames, then another. She continued until her hair was cropped short, falling just below her ears, in the way warrior women had worn it in the old days. "I am teaching them," she said finally, her voice calm and cold as river stone, "that Apache land is not a place to put stakes, that some things cannot be bought or threatened or killed, that they have made a terrible mistake." She looked at her niece across the fire, and in that look was something ancient and implacable, something that predated governments and treaties and maps drawn by men who had never walked this ground. "If you stay, you will see things that will change you. You may die. You certainly will never be able to go back to the life you knew. So I ask you one more time, do you want to leave?" Nijoni looked at the burning hair, at the dead cows at the stakes, claiming ownership of land that had belonged to her people since before anyone kept records. She looked at her aunt, this woman who had lost everything and refused to be destroyed by the loss. "I am Mangus's daughter," she said quietly. "He did not run, neither will I." Tsei nodded once, a short gesture of acknowledgement. Then she began sharpening her knife, the blade singing against the whetstone in a rhythm old as violence itself. Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal patterns, indifferent to human conflict. The wind carried the scent of blood and burnt hair down through the canyon, and in the darkness beyond the firelight, something moved. A coyote, perhaps, or a ghost, or simply the land itself stirring in response to promises made and broken. The surveyors would report back to their employers. Pike would return with more men, more threats, more demonstrations of power. The wheels of legal theft would turn, grinding everything beneath them the way they had ground down every other obstacle between white expansion and complete domination. But Sei Nalnish had made a different kind of promise, one that did not depend on lawyers or documents or the approval of men who saw land as nothing more than profit waiting to be extracted. She had promised her dead son that his resting place would remain undisturbed. She had promised the spirits of her ancestors that their bones would not be scattered by machines digging for copper. These were the kind of promises that required blood to keep. She continued sharpening her knife, the sound carrying through the canyon like a heartbeat, steady and patient and absolutely certain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new threats, new attempts to erase everything she was and everything she protected. But tonight, she prepared. Tonight, she became the thing Pike and his employers could not imagine and would not understand until it was far too late. Tonight, she became the last guardian of Shadow Valley and the first of many ghosts they would create in their pursuit of metal buried beneath sacred ground. Dawn arrived cold and colorless, leaching the canyon walls of their familiar warmth. Sei had not slept. Sleep was a luxury for people who believed tomorrow would resemble yesterday, who trusted that the world would still recognize them when morning came. She had spent the night preparing, moving through tasks with the methodical precision of someone who understood that survival depended on details most people overlooked. The 3 dead cows lay where they had fallen, already attracting attention from creatures that understood the gift of sudden meat. Sei had watched ravens arrive in the pre-dawn darkness, their calls echoing off stone like prophecies spoken in a language only the dead could translate. She did not begrudge them the feast. Everything fed something else. This was the fundamental truth of the desert, older and more reliable than any law white men might write on paper. Nijoni emerged from the wickiup as the sun broke above the eastern rim. The girl had slept poorly, her dreams interrupted by sounds both real and imagined. Sei could see the exhaustion in her niece's face, the way fear had carved temporary lines around her eyes and mouth. This was good. Fear kept you alert. Fear kept you alive, provided you did not let it transform into paralysis. "We should bury them," Nijoni said, looking at the dead cattle. Her voice carried the uncertain quality of someone making a suggestion she expected to be rejected. "No," Sei replied. "We let them rot where they fell. Let Pike and his men see what their violence produces. Let them smell it every time they come here. But the stench will be unbearable." Good. The unbearable should not be hidden. It should be witnessed. Sei began walking toward the spring, her movements unhurried despite the urgency thrumming beneath her skin. Nijoni followed, struggling to match her aunt's pace across terrain that seemed determined to twist ankles and shred the thin soles of her inappropriate boots. At the spring, Sei knelt and drank deeply, then splashed cold water on her face and the back of her neck. The shock of it helped sharpen her thinking. She needed clarity now more than ever. The surveyors had been a warning. Pike and his men had been a threat. What came next would be the actual assault, and she needed to be ready. "Aunt Sei," Nijoni said hesitantly, "what did you mean last night when you said you would teach them?" Sei considered her answer carefully. The girl deserved truth, but truth came in many forms. Some truths clarified. Others simply frightened. "Apache warriors used to raid Mexican settlements," she said finally. "Not for sport, but for survival. They would take horses, food weapons, things they needed to live. The Mexicans called them savages, criminals. They sent soldiers to exterminate the Apache like vermin." She paused, letting water drip from her cupped hands back into the spring. But Apache warriors were not savages. They were protectors. They understood that sometimes you must take from those who have too much so that your people can have enough. They understood that the choice is not between violence and peace. The choice is between dying quietly or dying in a way that means something. "Are you going to kill them?" Nijoni asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If necessary." "That makes you no different from them." Sei turned to face her niece, and in her eyes was something that made the younger woman take an involuntary step backward. "I am nothing like them. They kill for profit, for land. They will never live on for copper. they will sell to people they will never meet. I kill to protect the graves of my family. There is no comparison." Before Nijoni could respond, the sound of a single horse approaching made both women turn. Tsei's hand moved to her knife, but she did not draw it. The rider was alone, moving slowly, his hands clearly visible and empty of weapons. This was either stupidity or something else entirely. The man who dismounted at the edge of the clearing was not young, perhaps 35, with dark hair going gray at the temples and eyes that had witnessed things he wished he had not. He wore simple clothing, work-roughened trousers, and a shirt that had been mended multiple times. His hands were scarred in the specific way of men who worked with metal and heat. "Mrs. Nalnish," he said, and his voice carried the careful respect of someone who understood he was on uncertain ground. "My name is Thomas Garrett. I am a blacksmith in Copper Springs. I need to speak with you about something important." Tsei studied him in silence. There was something familiar about his face, though she could not immediately place what. She had learned to read people the way she read animal tracks, interpreting small signs that revealed larger truths. This man was nervous but not threatening. He carried guilt like a physical weight on his shoulders. "You have 1 minute," she said. Thomas glanced at Nijoni, and something flickered across his face. Recognition, or perhaps something deeper. The girl stared at him with an expression Sei could not quite interpret, something between fear and longing. "I served with the 4th Cavalry," Thomas said, speaking quickly as if afraid his courage would fail. "Back in '89. I was part of the unit that tracked Apache families trying to reach Mexico after Geronimo's surrender. We were ordered to bring them back to the reservation by any means necessary." He paused, swallowing hard. The morning sun had climbed high enough now to illuminate his face completely, and Sei could see the fine network of lines around his eyes, the premature gray that came from carrying burdens too heavy for one man's shoulders. "There was a man named Mongus," Thomas continued, his voice dropping lower. "Your brother, I believe. He was protecting a group of women and children, maybe 15 people total. Families who had slipped away from the reservation because they were starving, because the government rations were not enough to keep them alive through winter." Tsei felt something shift inside her chest, a careful wall she had built around certain memories beginning to crack. She had known her brother died fighting cavalry, but she had never learned the specific circumstances. The story had always been vague, filtered through multiple retellings, until it became more legend than fact. Thomas seemed to gather himself before continuing. "We cornered them in a box canyon about 30 miles south of here. It was late afternoon, the sun already setting. My commanding officer, Captain Morrison, ordered us to fire warning shots over their heads. He wanted them to surrender peacefully. Morrison was not a cruel man, just following orders." The blacksmith's hands trembled slightly as he spoke, and he clasped them together to still the shaking. "But there was a young private barely 18 years old. Johnston was his name. He had joined the cavalry 3 months earlier, fresh from Pennsylvania, had never seen combat, had never even seen an Apache person up close. When Mongus stepped forward to negotiate, Johnston thought he was reaching for a weapon. He fired." Thomas closed his eyes, and when he opened them again they were wet. "The bullet hit Mongus in the chest. He went down immediately. The women started screaming. Some of the children tried to run. It was chaos. Captain Morrison was shouting for everyone to hold fire, but 2 more soldiers panicked and started shooting. By the time Morrison got control of the situation, 3 people were dead. Mongus, an old woman, and a boy who could not have been more than 10 years old." Nijoni made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper. Tsei reached out without thinking and gripped her niece's arm, steadying her. "Among the survivors," Thomas said, looking directly at Nijoni now, "was a woman named Sarah. She was white, originally from a settlement near Fort Apache. She had married Mongus in some kind of Apache ceremony, though it was not recognized by the military or the territorial government. She was holding a blanket around herself, and I could see she was pregnant." His voice broke slightly. "Captain Morrison wanted to send her back to the reservation with the others, but I knew what that meant. The reservation administrators would separate her from the Apache women, would treat her like a prisoner, or worse. So I did something I am not proud of, but also not sorry for. I falsified the casualty report. I listed Sarah among the dead, said she had been killed in the crossfire. Then I helped her escape." Thomas reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather pouch. From it he pulled a tarnished silver locket and handed it to Nijoni. The girl opened it with shaking hands. Inside was a miniature portrait of a young Apache man painted with careful detail. "Your father," Thomas said. "Sarah commissioned that portrait from a traveling artist in Phoenix about a year before he died. She wanted you to know what he looked like. I have been keeping it safe, waiting for the right time to give it to you." Nijoni stared at the portrait, tears streaming down her face. The man in the image had strong features, dark eyes that seemed to look directly at the viewer with both gentleness and fierce determination. This was Mongus. This was her father transformed from abstract memory into concrete reality. After she escaped, Thomas continued, Sarah made her way to Phoenix. She gave birth 6 months later in a boarding house run by a widow who did not ask too many questions. She named the baby Nijoni after Mongus's mother. She told me this in a letter she sent a year later. He pulled out more items from the leather pouch. A stack of letters tied with string, their edges yellowed and fragile, a small beaded bracelet, a lock of dark hair wrapped in cloth. I sent Sarah money when I could, though I never signed my name to the packages. I could not bring myself to make contact directly, could not face the woman whose husband I had helped kill even accidentally. But I kept track of her. I knew when she moved from Phoenix to the reservation. I knew when she fell ill with consumption. I knew when she died 2 months ago. Thomas looked at Sei, his expression pleading for something that might have been understanding or forgiveness. I owed a debt, he said simply. Mongus was protecting his family. I was part of the force that killed him, even if I did not pull the trigger. The money was nothing. It could not bring him back or give Nijoni the father she deserved, but it was all I could offer. The silence that followed was heavy with emotions too complex to name. Sei watched her niece clutch the locket, watched her trace the painted features of a father she had never known. The girl was crying openly now, making no attempt to hide or control her grief. Finally Sei spoke. "You did not ride here to confess old sins and deliver mementos. What do you want?" Thomas nodded, acknowledging the directness. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The cover bore military insignia, faded but still visible. "I want to give you this. It is my complete service record from the cavalry, including detailed notes about every action our unit participated in. I kept meticulous records because I thought someday someone would want to know the truth about what we did out here. The orders. We followed the people we killed or displaced." He opened the journal to a page marked with a strip of cloth and held it so Sei could see. The handwriting was neat and precise, the kind of careful script military men were trained to maintain for official documentation. "One of those entries is about Victorio Chato," Thomas said, "the man whose signature supposedly appears on the deed transferring Shadow Valley to Arizona Copper Company." Sei's attention sharpened. She took the journal from his hands and read the entry he indicated. March 4, 1889. Burial detail for prisoner Victorio Chato, Apache warrior, age approximately 45. Died of pneumonia in the Fort Grant stockade at 0400 hours. Interred in the military cemetery with minimal ceremony despite my protest to the fort commander. Chato fought bravely and deserved honors befitting a warrior. Future generations should remember that even in defeat some men maintain their dignity. The entry was signed and dated, witnessed by 2 other soldiers whose names Thomas had written in the margin. Victorio Chato died in March of '89, Thomas said. But according to the deed Arizona Copper Company is using to claim this land, he signed away mineral and land rights in November of '88. Unless he could sign documents from beyond the grave, that signature is fraudulent. Sei looked up from the journal, seeing Thomas with new understanding. This was not just confession, this was ammunition. "Why are you giving me this?" she asked. "Because what is happening here is wrong," Thomas replied, and for the first time his voice carried anger instead of guilt. "I have done enough wrong in my life. I helped kill your brother, even if it was an accident born of fear and incompetence. I stood by while families were torn apart, while land was stolen, while promises were broken so many times that the concept of promise lost all meaning. He gestured toward Nijoni, who was still staring at her father's portrait. "That girl is the daughter of a man I helped murder. She deserves to know that some white men are capable of doing the right thing, even if it comes too late to matter. And you deserve to have the tools to fight back against people who think they can steal whatever they want because they have lawyers and guns and the government on their side." Tsei studied the journal, flipping through pages filled with Thomas's careful documentation. Here was proof not just of Victorio Chato's death, but of dozens of other incidents, other frauds, other moments when official records had been manipulated to justify theft and violence. "This is dangerous for you to possess," she said. "If Arizona Copper discovers you have this, they will not simply fire you or run you out of town. They will kill you." "I know. And yet you brought it here anyway." "I am tired of being afraid. I am tired of watching injustice happen and telling myself it is not my responsibility to stop it. I am tired of being the kind of man who looks away when looking away is easier than acting." He straightened his shoulders, and in that gesture, Tsei could see the young soldier he had once been before guilt and compromise had bent him into shapes he had not chosen. "When the time comes," Thomas said, "when you need someone to testify in a court of law about what is in that journal, I will be there. I will tell the truth regardless of the consequences. That is my promise to you and to the memory of your brother." Tsei closed the journal carefully and held it against her chest. This was more than evidence. This was vindication proof that her resistance was not just the stubbornness of a grieving woman, but a legitimate defense against documented fraud. "Go," she said to Thomas, "and do not come back unless I send for you. Your presence here puts you in danger I cannot protect you from. When I need you to testify, I will find a way to contact you." Thomas nodded and turned to mount his horse, but before he left he looked at Nijoni one more time. "Your father was a brave man," he said. "He stood in front of those women and children knowing the soldiers had rifles, and he had nothing. He did not beg or plead or try to save himself. He simply stood his ground and demanded that we treat his people with dignity. That is not a small thing. That is everything." After Thomas rode away, his horse's hoofbeats fading into the distance, Nijoni sank to the ground as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Her body shook with sobs she had been holding back during the conversation, grief and rage and confusion pouring out in waves. Tsei stood over her niece for a long moment, uncertain what comfort to offer. Physical affection had never been her strength. She understood how to set broken bones and treat infections, but emotional wounds were more complicated, more resistant to simple remedies. Finally, she sat down beside Nijoni and placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture felt awkward and unpracticed, but the girl leaned into it as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become liquid and unstable. "My father," Nijoni said between sobs. "He died because a boy got scared. That is all. Not evil, not hatred, not even intention. Just fear. Just a moment of panic from someone who should never have been given a gun and pointed at people he did not understand." "Most violence starts with fear," Sei said quietly. "That does not make it less deadly. That does not bring back the dead. How do you bear it?" Nijoni looked up, her face streaked with tears and dust. "Knowing that the people you loved died for nothing, for mistakes, for things that should not have happened but did anyway." Tsei was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun climb higher, transforming the canyon from shadow to brilliant light. A hawk circled overhead riding thermals, invisible to human eyes, hunting for prey that would sustain it through another day. "You bear it because the alternative is to stop bearing anything at all," she said finally. "To become hollow, to let the grief consume everything until there is nothing left but emptiness. I have my son and my husband in the ground 20 feet from here. Every morning I wake up and remember they are dead. Every morning I choose to continue living anyway. Why? Because someone must remember them. Someone must speak their names and tell their stories. Someone must ensure that the place where they rest remains undisturbed, that their bones are not scattered by machines digging for metal." She turned to look directly at her niece. If I surrender, if I leave or die without fighting, they become nothing. Just bones in dirt that strangers will dig through, just obstacles to profit that must be removed. I cannot allow that. I will not. Nijoni wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving muddy streaks across her face. When she spoke again, her voice was steadier, as if the grief had burned through something and left behind harder material. "Teach me," she said. "Teach you what? How to be like you. How to be strong enough to fight even when fighting seems impossible. How to protect what matters even when the whole world says it does not matter at all." Sei shook her head slowly. "You do not want to be like me. I am half dead, already staying alive only because promises still bind me to this world. You are young. You can still leave, still build a life that does not revolve around death and resistance and waiting for violence you know is coming." "I do not want that life," Nijoni said with surprising force. "I do not want to work in white people's houses, cleaning their floors and raising their children while pretending I am grateful for the privilege. I do not want to marry some reservation farmer and have babies who will grow up knowing they are Apache, but not knowing what that truly means." She clutched the locket with her father's portrait. "I want to matter. I want my existence to mean something more than just survival, more than just enduring until I die and am forgotten. If my father could stand in front of rifles to protect his people, I can stand here with you." "Fighting will not make you matter," Sei warned. "It will only make you dangerous, and dangerous people die young." "Then teach me to be dangerous. Teach me to be the kind of dangerous that makes powerful men afraid." Sei studied her niece's face, seeing determination beginning to replace grief. This was both encouraging and troubling. Determined people accomplished things, but they also died for those accomplishments more often than not. "If I teach you," Sei said carefully, measuring each word, "you must understand that there is no going back. Once you learn certain things, you cannot unlearn them. Once you do certain things, you cannot undo them. The person you are now will not be the person you become. Are you prepared for that transformation?" "Yes." "You say yes now, but you have not yet faced the choice between your life and your principles. That choice changes people in ways they cannot predict or control." "Then let it change me. I am tired of being powerless. I am tired of being invisible." Against her better judgment, against the voice in her head that warned this would only lead to more grief, Sei nodded. "We start now. Take off those ridiculous boots. You cannot move properly in them, cannot feel the ground beneath your feet, cannot learn what the earth is trying to tell you." Nijoni removed her boots eagerly, revealing feet that were soft and uncalloused, completely unprepared for the terrain they would need to navigate. Sei looked at those tender feet and felt something like pity, though she would not name it as such. "Your first lesson is pain," she said. "Not inflicting it, but enduring it. Your feet will bleed. Your muscles will cramp. Your body will beg you to stop. You must learn to hear those pleas and continue anyway. Pain is just information. It tells you that you are still alive, still capable of feeling. That is useful knowledge." She began walking toward the canyon wall, moving at a pace that looked casual but covered ground quickly. Nijoni followed, and within minutes, Sei heard the sharp intake of breath that meant sharp rocks and thorns had found soft skin. "Do not slow down," Sei called without looking back. "Do not favor the injured foot. Distribute the pain evenly. Your body will adapt faster than you think possible." They climbed until the wickiup below looked small as a child's toy, until Nijoni's breathing came in ragged gasps and sweat soaked through her calico dress. Sei stopped at a narrow ledge that overlooked the entire valley, a place where one misstep would mean a fatal fall. "Look," she said, gesturing at the vista spread below them. "What do you see?" Nijoni struggled to catch her breath, her legs trembling from exertion. "I see our home," she managed. "No, look deeper. See with more than your eyes. See the way a hunter sees, the way a warrior sees. What is actually there?" Nijoni was quiet, concentrating despite her exhaustion. "I see water, the spring. I see shelter, the wickiup. I see places where animals come to drink at dawn and dusk." "Good. Now see the rest. See where men on horses would have to ride if they wanted to enter the canyon. See how the narrow passage forces them to move in single file, vulnerable to attack from above. See where someone standing watch could spot approaching riders from miles away, giving time to prepare or escape." Understanding began to dawn on Nijoni's face as she studied the landscape with new eyes. The canyon was not just beautiful. It was a fortress designed by nature to protect those who understood its features. "You are going to use the land itself as a weapon," she said. "The land is already a weapon. I am simply going to teach Pike and his men to understand that truth. They see this place as empty space containing valuable minerals. They do not see it as a living thing with its own defenses, its own ways of protecting what belongs to it." Over the following hours, as the sun climbed toward its apex and heat began radiating from the stone, Tsei taught her niece the fundamentals of what she called desert thinking. How to read the land not as scenery, but as a living text that revealed the movements of everything that crossed it. How animal tracks told stories about where water could be found, where predators hunted, where prey felt safe enough to rest. She showed Nijoni how to identify plants by touch when visibility was poor, how to distinguish between species that could heal and species that could kill. How the difference between medicine and poison was often simply a matter of dosage and timing. "This is datura," she said, pointing to a plant growing in the shade of an overhang. "In very small amounts it treats pain and can induce visions useful for spiritual purposes. In larger amounts it causes hallucinations, seizures, sometimes death. A person who drinks water containing datura extract will see things that are not there, will hear voices, will lose the ability to distinguish between reality and nightmare." She carefully harvested several flowers and seed pods, wrapping them in a cloth. "If you put this in a water source," Nijoni said slowly, working through the implications, "anyone who drinks will be poisoned." Poisoned is a harsh word. Disoriented is more accurate. Their own minds will become their enemies. They will fear shadows and hear threats that do not exist. And fearful men make mistakes, reveal weaknesses, sometimes hurt each other in their confusion. That seems cruel. Crueler than shooting my cows to frighten me, crueler than threatening to burn my home while I sleep, crueler than digging up the graves of my ancestors to get at copper buried beneath their bones. Nijoni had no answer to that. They continued the lesson, moving from plant to plant, and Sei explained the properties of each. This one caused violent vomiting. That one induced temporary paralysis. Another created a rash so severe that men would tear at their own skin trying to relieve the itching. "My grandmother taught me all of this," Sei said. "She was a medicine woman, a healer, but she understood that the same knowledge that saves lives can also take them. She taught me that healing and harming are two sides of the same blade, and the wielder must choose which edge to turn toward the world." By the time they returned to the wickiup, the sun had passed its zenith and begun its slow descent toward the western horizon. Nijoni's feet were bleeding, leaving faint red marks on the stone. Her face was sunburned despite her darker complexion. Her muscles trembled with exhaustion. But when Sei looked at her, she saw something new in the girl's eyes. Not just determination, but understanding. Nijoni was beginning to grasp what it meant to survive in a world that wanted you dead or gone. They found another visitor waiting near the wickiup. This one Sei recognized immediately, and the recognition brought neither joy nor surprise. Just a weary acknowledgement that betrayal came in familiar forms. Goyawe stood uncertainly at the edge of the clearing, his posture defensive, his eyes unable to meet hers directly. He was Apache, perhaps 45 years old, with a face carved by wind and disappointment into something harder than the surrounding stone. Sei had known him since childhood, had watched him transform from a proud warrior into a reservation farmer who grew crops in soil that barely sustained life. "Goyawe," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You should be at San Carlos with your family." "I came to warn you," he said, the words tumbling out quickly as if he feared losing courage. "The men from Arizona Copper Company, they came to the reservation yesterday. They are offering money for information about you, about your daily routines, your vulnerabilities when you are alone and when others might be here. And did you take their money? The question hung in the air between them, sharp as a drawn blade. Goyawe's face flushed with shame and anger, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. Yes, he admitted finally. $500. More money than I have seen in my entire life. Enough to get my family away from the reservation, away from government rations that keep us barely alive, away from the slow death of watching my children grow up hungry and hopeless. What did you tell them in exchange for this fortune? Nothing yet, Goyawe said quickly. That is why I came here, to warn you before I have to deliver the information they paid for. To give you a chance to run to hide, to do something other than wait here for them to come with guns and legal documents and all the power of the territorial government behind them. Tsei moved closer, studying his face the way she might study an animal exhibiting unusual behavior. Goyawe would not meet her eyes, his gaze sliding away to focus on neutral ground. You are lying, she said calmly. Not about the money. That part is true. But about coming here to warn me. You came here to ease your conscience, to tell yourself you gave me a chance before you sold me to men who want me dead or gone. That is not fair. Fair. Tsei laughed, a short, bitter sound. You sold information about me for $500, and you want to talk about what is fair? My wife is dying, Goyawe said, and now anger crept into his voice, hot and desperate. She has the consumption, the cough that never stops, that brings up blood and pieces of lung. The reservation doctor says she needs medicine. They do not have treatment in a sanitarium somewhere far from here. $500 could save her life. What would you do in my place? Would you let your wife die to protect your principles? The question struck deeper than Sei wanted to admit. She thought of Daklugye, of the desperate measures she had attempted to save him from smallpox. She thought of Nietzsche, of the bargains she would have made with any god or demon who promised to let her son live. I understand your choice, she said finally. I do not forgive it, but I understand it. You traded my life for your wife's. That is a calculation many people would make. Then you will not stop me. You will not try to prevent me from giving them the information. How would I stop you, kill you, that would make me the monster they already believe I am? No, Goyawe. You must make your own choice and live with its consequences. She turned away from him, walking toward the graves of her husband and son. She knelt there, placing both hands flat on the sun-warmed earth. But understand this, she said without looking back. When you give Arizona Copper the information they paid for, you are not just betraying me. You are betraying every Apache person who ever fought to keep our land, our dignity, our right to exist in the places our ancestors have lived for generations beyond counting. Your wife may live because of that money. But you will die knowing you helped destroy one of the last pieces of Apache land not controlled by the government or stolen by white men. Goyawe stood silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. I am already dead inside. I died the day I moved to the reservation and started farming land that produces barely enough to keep us alive. I died when I cut my hair and put on white man's clothes and stopped teaching my children to speak Apache because speaking our language only makes white people angry. He turned to leave, then paused. They are coming tomorrow at dawn. 20 men, maybe more. Pinkerton agents and some cavalry soldiers who do not care about laws or treaties or anything except getting paid. They will kill you, Tsei. They will burn this place and scatter your bones and build their mine on top of everything you are trying to protect. Then I will make them pay dearly for every foot of ground they take. That is pride talking. Pride does not stop bullets. No, Tsei agreed, but it makes the bullets mean something. After Goyawe left, Nijoni approached her aunt cautiously. You let him go. After what he did, after what he admitted, you just let him walk away. What would you have me do? Kill him? Hurt him? That would not change anything. He would still have sold the information. Arizona Copper would still be coming. But he betrayed you. Yes. And now he must live knowing he betrayed someone who showed him mercy instead of violence. That is a harsher punishment than anything I could inflict on his body. Guilt is a wound that never heals cleanly. Tsei stood and began gathering materials, moving through the clearing with renewed purpose. She collected plants she had identified during the day's lesson, mushrooms, with distinctive coloring roots that had to be handled with cloth to avoid absorbing their toxins through skin. From her medicine bag she withdrew small clay pots containing substances she had prepared long ago for purposes she had hoped never to use. Nijoni watched, trying to understand the pattern in her aunt's actions. "What are you preparing?" "Defense. If they are bringing 20 men, I cannot fight them directly. 20 rifles against my knife and your inexperience would end quickly and badly. But I can make them afraid. I can turn their own minds against them. Fear is more powerful than bullets when wielded correctly." She began grinding the datura flowers into fine powder, mixing it with liquid from crushed roots. The paste that resulted was pale green and smelled faintly sweet, almost pleasant. "This will go into their water supply," she explained. "By tomorrow afternoon, any man who drinks from the spring will begin experiencing visions. They will see things that are not there, hear voices, feel presences. Their own minds will become battlefields. You are going to poison them. I am going to introduce uncertainty into their certainty. Men like Pike believe they understand the world, believe their superior weapons and numbers guarantee victory. I will teach them that some battles are fought in territory they cannot map or control, that the land itself can be an enemy." As evening approached, they worked together preparing defenses. Tsei showed Nijoni how to set simple snares designed not to catch animals, but to trip men moving through darkness. How to arrange stones in patterns that looked natural but would betray the presence of anyone disturbing them. How to create false paths that led to dead ends or dangerous drops. The Apache survived for generations against Spanish soldiers, then Mexican soldiers, then American cavalry, Tsei said as they worked. "Not because we had better weapons, but because we knew the land and they did not. We disappeared into terrain they could not navigate. We struck from shadows and melted away before they could respond. We made them afraid of every rock and tree, every shadow that might hide a warrior. But there were many Apache then. Now there is just you, just us. Numbers matter less than knowledge. One person who understands every feature of the landscape, every hidden approach, every source of water and shelter, can defeat many people who see only empty space." As night fell, they moved through the canyon with Nijoni learning to navigate by starlight. Tsei taught her how to step without sound, how to use shadows for concealment, how to freeze completely when necessary, becoming just another stone in a landscape of stone. They traveled to the main spring, the source that fed the smaller streams and pools throughout Shadow Valley. This was where any attacking force would need to refill canteens and water horses, especially in the brutal August heat. Tsei knelt beside the water and carefully poured her prepared mixture into the current, watching it dissipate into invisible solution. By tomorrow evening, this will have spread throughout the entire spring system. Anyone who drinks will begin experiencing effects within a few hours. What if innocent people drink it? What if Apache families passing through stop here? No Apache families pass through here anymore. The government prohibits travel outside reservation boundaries. The only people who will drink this water are the men coming to drive us out or kill us. They have made their choice. I am simply ensuring they understand the consequences. As they worked their way back toward the wickiup, the silence between them grew comfortable rather than awkward. Nijoni was learning to move with more confidence, placing her feet with greater care, breathing quietly even during exertion. They arrived to find yet another visitor, though this one had not bothered to announce his presence with the courtesy of waiting to be acknowledged. Sheriff Elias Cormack sat on a rock near the fire pit, his badge catching starlight, his considerable bulk settled with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. He was perhaps 50 years old, going soft around the middle, with eyes that had seen too much and forgiven too little of what they witnessed. His gun belt hung heavy with a pistol that looked well maintained and frequently used. "Mrs. Nalnish," he said without rising, "we need to have a conversation about your situation here." "Speak quickly," Tsei replied. "I have work that cannot wait." I am here in an official capacity. He pulled a folded document from his coat pocket. Arizona Copper Company has filed formal complaints about harassment, property damage, and threats against their employees. They also report that one of their surveyors has gone missing. Man named Henderson, last seen in this area 3 days ago. I know nothing about missing surveyors. Funny thing is, we found his body this morning, throat cut from ear to ear, left to bleed out about 2 miles from here. Real professional work, the kind of killing that requires knowledge and skill. Now the company seems to think you might be responsible. The company seems to think many things that are not supported by evidence. Cormac smiled, but the expression carried no warmth. Evidence is a flexible concept out here in the territories. Sometimes what matters is not what actually happened, but what people with money and influence say happened. He stood slowly, his hand resting casually near his pistol. Look, I do not particularly care about the politics of land ownership. That is for lawyers and judges to argue about in courtrooms far from here. But I do care about maintaining order in my jurisdiction. Dead bodies complicate my life, make my job harder, attract attention from territorial officials who ask uncomfortable questions. Then perhaps you should investigate who actually killed this Henderson rather than accepting payment from Arizona Copper to blame me without proof. The sheriff's face darkened. You want to be careful making accusations like that, woman. Claiming a lawman takes bribes is a serious matter. Is it more serious than actually taking them? Because everyone in Copper Springs knows you supplement your salary with payments from the mining companies. Everyone knows you look the other way when they need workers beaten or union organizers run out of town. Everyone knows you serve whoever pays you most generously. Cormac took a step forward, his bulk suddenly threatening despite the distance between them. I am going to give you some free advice, Mrs. Nalnish. Take whatever money Arizona Copper is offering and leave quietly. Pack up your things, say goodbye to this godforsaken canyon, and find somewhere else to live out your days in peace. And if I refuse, then things will get unpleasant. Accidents happen out here. Fires start for no apparent reason. People disappear and their bodies are never found. It would be a terrible shame if something unfortunate occurred to you or to that girl you have taken in. The implied threat against Nijoni made Sei's hand move toward her knife, but she controlled the impulse. Killing the sheriff would bring consequences she was not yet ready to face. Tell Cornelius Ravenclaw that I am not leaving, she said, her voice dropping into a register that carried absolute certainty. Tell him that every man he sends here will face something he does not understand and cannot control. Tell him that this land has teeth, and they are very sharp. That sounds remarkably like a threat. It is a promise. There is a difference. Cormac adjusted his gun belt, the gesture calculated to draw attention to his weapon. I came here tonight as a courtesy to give you one last chance to avoid what is coming. I am trying to help you even if you are too stubborn to see it. You came here to intimidate a woman living alone, to threaten her into surrendering what is rightfully hers. That is not help. That is coercion backed by the pretense of legal authority. The sheriff's face flushed with anger, but he controlled himself with visible effort. Have it your way, then. But when the Pinkerton agents arrive tomorrow, do not expect any assistance from me. As far as I am concerned, whatever happens out here is between you and them. I will file my report saying you were given every opportunity to leave peacefully and chose violence instead. An accurate report for once. How refreshing. After Cormac rode away, his horse's hooves echoing off the canyon walls, Nijoni spoke in a voice that trembled slightly. They are all against us. The company, the law, even our own people like Goyawe. How can we possibly survive when everyone with power wants us gone or dead? Sei sat down heavily, suddenly feeling every one of her 32 years, plus the accumulated weight of all the grief and struggle those years contained. We probably cannot survive, she said quietly. Not if survival means defeating them completely, driving them away permanently, recovering everything that has been stolen. That kind of victory is impossible for 2 women with knives and poison against 20 men with rifles and the backing of territorial government. Then why fight at all? Why not just leave, find somewhere else, live to see another day? Sei looked toward the graves of her husband and son, barely visible in the starlight. Because some things are worth losing for. because the manner of your defeat matters as much as the fact of it. Because I want my son's spirit to know that his mother did not surrender without resistance, that she kept her promise to protect the place where he rests." She turned to face her niece. "Tomorrow they will come with their guns and their legal documents and their absolute certainty that they deserve what they are taking. We will show them otherwise. We will teach them that theft has consequences, that some ground cannot be taken without paying a price so high it transforms victory into something that tastes like defeat. How do we do that? By becoming the thing they fear more than death. By becoming ghosts in their own minds, haunting them until they beg to leave, until they understand that Shadow Valley is not just defended by two women, but by the land itself, by spirits they do not believe in, but will learn to fear." Nijoni nodded slowly, understanding that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Whatever happened when dawn came would define the rest of her life, whether that life lasted another 50 years or ended with tomorrow's sunrise. They sat together in the darkness, aunt and niece, the last defenders of ground that had drunk the blood of their ancestors and would soon drink more. Around them the canyon settled into its nighttime rhythms. Creatures emerged to hunt or be hunted. The wind carried scents of sage and dust. Stars wheeled overhead in patterns that had guided Apache people for generations beyond counting. Tsei began to sing softly in the old language, a song her grandmother had taught her, a song about women who became mountains immovable and eternal. Nijoni listened, committing the words to memory, understanding that this might be the last night she would hear such songs, the last night the world would contain this particular configuration of past and present. As midnight approached, they made final preparations. Sei checked her weapons, sharpened her knife until it could split hairs, verified that the poison had properly dispersed through the water system. Nijoni practiced the movements her aunt had taught her, learning to drop silently from heights, to throw stones with accuracy, to disappear into shadows. Just before dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, Tsei climbed to the highest point overlooking the canyon entrance. From here she could see for miles in every direction, and there, like dark insects crawling across the pale desert floor, she saw them coming. 20 riders moving in disciplined formation. Behind them a wagon carrying supplies, and she suspected additional weapons. They advanced with the confidence of overwhelming force men who had never faced serious resistance and did not expect to encounter any now. Tsei watched them approach and felt something settle inside her, a cold clarity that preceded action. This was the moment she had been preparing for since Pike and his men had driven their stakes into her land. This was the test that would determine whether her resistance meant anything or was simply the futile gesture of a woman who could not accept the inevitable. She climbed down to where Nijoni waited, the girl's face pale but determined in the pre-dawn light. "They are here," Tsei said simply. 20 men well-armed, moving like soldiers who know their business. This is your last chance to leave, to walk away, to choose survival over whatever happens next. Nijoni looked at the locket hanging around her neck, the portrait of the father she had never known, the father who had died standing in front of rifles to protect his people. "I am my father's daughter," she said. "I do not run." Tsei nodded once, a sharp gesture of acknowledgement and acceptance. "Then we begin. Remember everything I taught you. Trust the land. Trust your instincts. And if the moment comes when you must choose between your life and your principles, choose life." Dead martyrs inspire songs, but they protect nothing. The sun broke above the canyon rim, flooding Shadow Valley with light that transformed stone from gray to gold. In that light, 2 women stood ready to defend ground that maps said belonged to a mining company, but which they knew belonged only to itself, to the bones buried beneath it, to the generations of Apache people who had lived and died here long before anyone thought to measure value in dollars or draw ownership lines on paper. And in the distance, growing closer with each passing minute, 20 men rode toward a confrontation they believed would be simple and brief, not understanding that they were riding into a trap that had been set not in days but in centuries, not by 2 women, but by the land itself, and everyone who had ever loved it enough to fight for it. The last stand of Shadow Valley was about to begin. The first rider entered the canyon as the sun cleared the eastern rim, casting his shadow long and thin across ground that had witnessed violence before and would witness it again. Pike returned to Shadow Valley 3 days later, this time leading double the force, 30 armed men and a wagon laden with explosives. Behind him came 19 others, spreading into tactical positions with military precision that suggested professional training. Tse-Yi watched from a concealed position high on the canyon wall, her body pressed flat against stone still cool from night. Beside her, Nijoni breathed shallowly through her mouth, fighting the urge to move or speak. They had been here since before dawn, waiting with the patience of predators who understood that stillness was its own form of power. From this vantage point, Tse-Yi could observe everything. The way Pike's horse moved with slight reluctance, picking its steps carefully across unfamiliar ground. The way 2 of the riders kept glancing upward at the canyon walls, professional enough to recognize vulnerable terrain when they rode through it. The way the youngest soldier gripped his rifle too tightly, knuckles white with tension that would make accurate shooting nearly impossible. Good. They were already nervous, already sensing that something about this place resisted their presence. Pike raised his hand and the formation halted in perfect unison. He stood in his stirrups, surveying the wickiup and the surrounding clearing. The 3 dead cows had bloated grotesquely in the August heat, their bodies swollen with gases that transformed them into obscene parodies of living animals. Ravens and vultures contested ownership of the feast, their harsh calls echoing off stone walls that seemed to amplify every sound. "Mrs. Nalnish," Pike called out, his voice carrying across the unnatural silence. "I know you are here somewhere. Come out and we can discuss this situation like reasonable people. There is no need for further unpleasantness." Tse-Yi remained absolutely motionless, watching. Let him talk to empty air. Let him feel the weight of the canyon's silence pressing down on his manufactured certainty. Pike waited a full minute, perhaps expecting a response, perhaps simply demonstrating patience to his men. When nothing came, he tried again, his voice hardening slightly. "The law is on our side, ma'am. We have a court order authorizing us to take possession of this property on behalf of Arizona Copper Company. You cannot win by hiding. Make this easy on yourself and that girl you have taken in. We are prepared to offer you safe passage to whichever reservation you prefer, plus a financial settlement of $200. Still nothing. Just the wind moving through stunted juniper branches, the distant cry of a hawk riding thermals above the canyon rim, the nervous stamping of horses who sensed their riders' growing tension and reflected it back in their own behavior. One of the men, younger than the others and clearly impatient with this theater of negotiation, turned to Pike. "Maybe she ran already. Maybe she is not even here anymore. Could be miles away by now." "She is here," Pike said flatly, with the certainty of someone trusting instinct over logic. "I can feel it. She is watching us right now." He was right to trust that feeling. Tse-Yi had no intention of running from ground she had promised to defend, but neither would she make Pike's job easy by presenting herself as a convenient target for men with rifles and legal documents that meant nothing to her. Pike signaled to his men with a series of hand gestures that confirmed Tse-Yi's assessment of their military background. They began to dismount in coordinated fashion, 5 staying with the horses, while the remaining 15 spread out in a textbook search pattern, moving toward the wickiup and the surrounding structures with weapons ready but not yet aimed. The first man to reach the wickiup pulled aside the entrance flap with exaggerated caution, clearly expecting resistance. He disappeared inside for perhaps 20 seconds before emerging and shaking his head to indicate the structure was empty. He moved immediately to the next building, a small storage hut constructed from stacked stone and weathered timber. That was when Tse-Yi made her first deliberate move. The stone she threw was not large, perhaps the size of a chicken egg, but she had spent hours the previous afternoon selecting rocks for precise weight and balance. This one struck the storage hut's roof with a sharp crack that froze every man in the clearing instantly. 15 rifles swung upward toward the canyon walls in perfect synchronization, fingers tightening on triggers, eyes scanning for targets. But there was nothing to shoot at, just empty stone and shadow and the slowly fading echo of impact. "What the hell was that?" someone demanded, his voice pitched higher than he probably intended. Rockfall, another man replied, though uncertainty colored his tone. These canyons are geologically unstable, happens all the time in this kind of formation. Pike was not convinced. He turned in a slow, calculated circle, studying the heights with the systematic attention of someone who had survived previous ambushes by taking nothing for granted. Keep moving, he ordered, but stay alert. If she is up there playing games, do not give her the satisfaction of seeing you rattled. The men resumed their methodical search, but their movements had changed subtly. They glanced upward more frequently, now flinched at ordinary sounds that moments earlier they would have ignored, moved with the heightened awareness of people who knew they were being observed but could not locate the observer. Tse-yi waited patiently until 3 men had clustered near the spring, kneeling to examine the water source that would be crucial to any extended operation in this heat. Then she threw her second stone, larger than the first, aimed with the precision she had developed hunting animals far more alert than these men. It struck the water directly in front of them, sending up a splash that made all 3 jump backward, reflexively, rifles swinging toward the point of impact. There, one shouted, pointing at ripples spreading across the spring's mirror-smooth surface. Something in the water. Could be she is hiding underwater somehow. They approached the spring with extreme caution, now weapons trained on the pool, as if expecting an enemy to rise from its depths, like some creature from mythology. The most experienced of the 3 knelt at the water's edge, cupping his hand to taste the liquid, testing for contamination or foreign substances. Just water, he reported after a moment's consideration. Cold, clean, nothing unusual about it that I can detect. Except there was something unusual, something his senses could not immediately identify. The datura extract had thoroughly permeated the spring system by now, dissolving into complete invisibility. Every drop contained enough of the powerful alkaloid compound to begin subtly affecting brain chemistry within hours of consumption. But the effects would not be immediate or obvious. Sei needed them to drink deeply, to fill canteens and water their horses, to convince themselves the spring was safe before the hallucinations began. By noon, the sun had climbed to its apex and heat pressed down on the canyon with physical weight. The men had completed their thorough search of the immediate area without finding any trace of Tse-yi or Nijoni. Now they gathered in whatever shade the canyon walls provided, drinking liberally from canteens they had filled at the spring, sharing hard bread and dried meat from their carefully rationed supplies. Pike stood apart from the others, studying a detailed map and making notations in the margins with a pencil worn down to a stub. He was intelligent enough to recognize something was fundamentally wrong with this situation, but not yet experienced enough with Apache tactics to understand exactly what. One of the Pinkerton agents approached him, a lean man with a terrible scar running from left temple to jaw, the kind of wound that suggested he had survived things that killed other men. "We have searched everywhere within a quarter-mile radius," he reported quietly. "The structures are all empty. There are no fresh tracks leading out of the canyon, but I cannot shake the feeling we are missing something critical." "We are," Pike agreed without looking up from his map. "The question is whether we are missing the women hiding in some location we have not yet discovered, or whether we are missing something else entirely, some factor we have not considered." "What do you want to do?" "Post guards on the canyon entrance. Rotating shifts, 2 men at all times. No one leaves or enters without my direct knowledge and permission. The rest of the men can rest in shifts, but I want weapons within arm's reach at all times and constant vigilance on those heights." The scarred man nodded and moved away to relay orders. Pike returned to studying his map, completely unaware that the first subtle effects of the datura were already beginning to work through his nervous system. The hallucinations would start almost imperceptibly, just slight distortions of normal perception. Colors seeming slightly more vivid than usual. Sounds acquiring strange echoes that did not quite match the canyon's acoustics. A vague sense of being watched that could easily be attributed to reasonable paranoia. In another hour, reality would begin to fracture in more noticeable and disturbing ways. From her hidden position, Tse-yi watched and waited with the infinite patience she had learned from decades of hunting. She understood that the hunter's greatest weapon was never speed or strength, but the willingness to wait for exactly the right moment. She had learned this truth tracking animals who could run faster, climb better, fight more effectively than any human. The key was never to match their strengths but to systematically exploit their weaknesses. Animals grew tired. Animals made mistakes. Animals eventually dropped their guard. Men were fundamentally the same, only more predictable. Men convinced themselves they were invulnerable right up until the precise moment something proved otherwise. As afternoon heat built toward its suffocating peak, subtle changes began manifesting in the men below. One kept swatting at his neck and arms, fighting off insects that were not actually there. Another claimed in an increasingly agitated voice that he could hear whispers, voices speaking just beyond the threshold of understanding, saying things that made the hair on his neck stand up. A third stared at his own hands with disturbing intensity, turning them over and over in the harsh sunlight as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Pike noticed these behavioral anomalies but attributed them to heat exhaustion and the psychological stress of searching hostile terrain while knowing they were being observed. "Drink more water," he ordered, completely unaware he was prescribing more of the very poison causing the problems. "Stay in whatever shade you can find. We can afford to wait them out. Time is on our side." But waiting meant more time for the poison to saturate their systems, more opportunities for paranoia to take root and flourish, more chances for the canyon itself to seem alive and actively malevolent. The first complete psychological breakdown came just after 3 in the afternoon, when the heat was at its most oppressive. A young Pinkerton agent, no more than 25 years old, suddenly lurched to his feet and began shouting at the canyon walls with desperate intensity. "I see you up there!" he screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "Stop hiding like a coward and come down here and fight like a human being." His companions rushed to restrain him, but he shoved them away with surprising violence, his eyes fixed on something only he could perceive. "Can you not see her? She is standing right there on that ledge, looking down at us with those dead black eyes, grinning like a skull." Everyone looked where he pointed with such conviction. There was nothing visible but empty stone and shadow. "Thompson, sit down right now," Pike commanded with the voice he used for enforcing absolute obedience. "You are experiencing heat stroke. You are seeing things that are not actually there." "I know what I see," Thompson insisted, but doubt had crept into his voice now, a thin edge of uncertainty that would only grow wider and more destabilizing as the hours crawled past. Pike ordered 2 men to take Thompson to the shadiest location available and keep him quiet. But the damage was done. The other men had witnessed the breakdown, had seen one of their own lose his grip on reality, and now they looked at each other with barely concealed suspicion, wondering who would be next. Tsei touched Nijoni's shoulder gently and gestured toward a narrow path invisible to anyone who did not already know it existed. The girl nodded understanding and began moving with the careful silence Tsei had drilled into her over the past days, placing each foot with exaggerated precision, testing her weight before committing to each step. They relocated to a different position, this one directly above the canyon entrance where the passage narrowed to its most constricted point. Here Tsei had spent yesterday afternoon arranging loose rocks into precarious piles held in place only by careful balance and small wooden wedges that could be kicked free with minimal effort. A controlled avalanche would not kill anyone, but it would effectively block the exit, transforming the canyon from a place these men were searching into a place where they were trapped. As the sun began its gradual descent toward the western horizon, painting the canyon walls in progressively deeper shades of amber and rose, the situation below continued its steady deterioration. More men were experiencing vivid hallucinations, now seeing movement in every shadow, hearing voices that spoke in languages they almost but not quite understood, feeling presences that vanished when they turned to look directly. One soldier swore with absolute conviction that he could see his dead mother standing beside the spring, her decomposing face somehow smiling as she beckoned him to come closer and drink. Another became utterly convinced that scorpions were crawling inside his shirt and tore the garment off despite the brutal sun clawing at skin that showed no marks or stings whatsoever. Pike tried desperately to maintain some semblance of order and discipline, but his own perceptions were fragmenting in ways he could no longer deny or rationalize. He saw the wickiup breathe its walls, expanding and contracting rhythmically like enormous lungs. He saw the 3 dead cows struggle to their feet and walk in slow, shambling circles before collapsing again into grotesque heaps. He saw Apache warriors materialize from solid stone, their bodies emerging directly from the canyon walls, only to dissolve like smoke when he attempted to focus on them directly. Some rational part of his mind understood intellectually that these were hallucinations, products of poison or heat stroke, or some nightmarish combination of environmental factors he had catastrophically failed to account for. But understanding something intellectually and maintaining emotional control in the face of it were entirely different challenges. "We are leaving," he announced suddenly, his voice carrying an edge of barely controlled panic. "Right now. Everyone mount up immediately. We ride back to Copper Springs, regroup with fresh men and better preparation, and return when we actually understand what we are facing here." But when the men moved to execute this order, they discovered a new problem. Their horses had scattered. The animals, already profoundly nervous in the unfamiliar canyon environment, had broken their tethers at some point during the confusion and fled in multiple directions. Some had made it completely out of the canyon and were presumably still running. Others stood at the far end of the clearing, refusing to approach despite their riders' increasingly frantic calls. "Someone cut them loose deliberately," the scarred Pinkerton agent said, examining severed ropes with professional attention. "This was not accident or panic. Someone moved through our perimeter and freed every single animal without being detected." Pike's face darkened with rage and fear in equal measure. "Find them. Round them up. Use whatever means necessary. We are absolutely not walking back through open desert in this condition." While the men chased their scattered mounts with decreasing coherence and effectiveness, Tseyi descended from her elevated position, with liquid silence moving through the chaos like smoke given temporary form. She was a ghost in her own land, invisible in the lengthening shadows, completely undetectable to men whose perceptions were already compromised. Her knife remained sheathed throughout this movement. She had no intention of killing unless circumstances made it absolutely unavoidable. Dead men became martyrs, symbols around which others could rally. Frightened men became cautionary tales, warnings to anyone else who might consider similar actions. She found what she was seeking near the supply wagon. 3 rifles leaning carelessly against the wooden wheel, temporarily abandoned while their owners pursued frightened horses. She took all 3 weapons quickly and efficiently, slinging 2 over her shoulder and carrying the 3rd, then melted back into the landscape before anyone could notice the theft. When Pike finally discovered the missing rifles, something fundamental broke in his carefully maintained facade of professional composure. "She is here right now," he shouted to his increasingly scattered men. "Moving among us like a ghost. Spread out in pairs, watch each other's backs, and find her. Bring her to me alive, if remotely possible, dead, if absolutely necessary." The men attempted to form organized search parties, but their effectiveness was catastrophically compromised by mounting fear and deepening confusion. They saw threats everywhere, jumped violently at completely ordinary sounds, sometimes aimed loaded rifles at each other before recognizing friendly faces in the gathering dusk. Tseyi watched from yet another concealed position, coldly calculating her next move. She had successfully disrupted their organization's stolen critical weapons and seeded paranoia deep into their collective psychology. But this was not yet sufficient. They still outnumbered her 15-2. They still possessed most of their weapons and ammunition. And Pike, despite his visibly deteriorating mental state, remained genuinely dangerous. She needed to escalate the psychological warfare. She needed to transform their growing fear into something so overwhelming and primal that it would drive them from Shadow Valley not merely tonight, but permanently, creating a story so terrifying that no one would willingly return. As darkness fell with the sudden completeness characteristic of desert regions, and men lit torches that created far more dancing shadows than actual useful illumination, Tseyi began to sing. The song was ancient, taught to her by her grandmother, who had learned it from her grandmother in an unbroken chain reaching back into time before anyone kept written records. It was a death chant, the song Apache women had traditionally sung over fallen warriors for countless generations. Her voice carried through the canyon with eerie clarity, seeming to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, simultaneously echoing off stone walls until it sounded like a chorus of ghosts singing in perfect harmony. The effect on the already destabilized men was immediate and psychologically devastating. Several dropped their rifles entirely and covered their ears with both hands, trying unsuccessfully to block out the sound. Others spun in frantic circles, attempting to locate the source of the singing with increasingly erratic movements. One fell to his knees and began praying loudly in a language Tsei did not recognize, possibly German or Dutch. Pike fired his pistol straight up into the darkening sky, the sharp crack momentarily silencing everything, including Tsei's song. "It is one woman," he screamed at his men, his voice ragged with desperation. "One single woman trying to frighten you with theatrical tricks. Do not give her the satisfaction of seeing you break." But his words completely lacked conviction now. His own hands shook visibly as he fumbled to reload his weapon. His eyes were far too wide, reflecting torchlight in ways that suggested he was seeing things the flames were not actually illuminating. That was precisely when something Tsei had not anticipated changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. A mountain lion's scream split the night air, that distinctive vocalization that makes even experienced hunters feel primitive fear deep in their bones. The cry came from somewhere high above, bouncing off canyon walls until it seemed to surround them completely, coming from every direction at once. The horses that men had managed to partially recapture went completely wild, bolting in pure panic. Two of them broke free again and disappeared into darkness at full gallop. The others bucked and reared with such violence that their handlers had to choose between maintaining control and maintaining their own safety. Tsei froze completely, listening with intense concentration. That had been a real mountain lion, not some acoustic trick or her imagination. A large male, judging from the depth and power of the vocalization. Perhaps drawn by the smell of the 3 dead, rotting cattle. Perhaps defending territory against all this unprecedented activity and noise. Or perhaps, she thought with something approaching spiritual awe, perhaps the land itself was fighting back through every available means, marshaling its defenses against invasion. The lion did not immediately attack, but its presence added an entirely new dimension of terror to men already operating at the ragged edge of psychological breakdown. Now they had to worry simultaneously about threats from above and below, about human enemies and animal predators, about dangers that were real and dangers that were products of their poisoned perceptions. Pike attempted one final time to rally his fragmenting force into some kind of defensive formation, but organizational cohesion had collapsed entirely. Some men huddled as close to the fires as they could get, staring into flames, as if heat could somehow burn away their mounting fear. Others stood in tight clusters of 2 or 3 weapons, pointing in every direction, occasionally shouting warnings about threats only they could see. One had actually climbed onto the supply wagon and absolutely refused to descend, claiming in a voice shrill with hysteria that the ground itself was covered in writhing snakes. In the midst of this chaos, Nijoni suddenly appeared beside Sei, moving with silence that filled her aunt with fierce pride. "The canyon entrance," she whispered, barely audible even at close range. "I can trigger the rock slide now. They are far too distracted to notice until it is finished." Sei considered this carefully. Trapping the men would make them exponentially more desperate and potentially more dangerous in unpredictable ways. But it would also eliminate their easiest avenue of escape, forcing them to truly confront what it meant to enter Apache land uninvited and unwelcome. "Do it," she decided. "But move with absolute caution. Do not allow yourself to be seen or caught." Nijoni disappeared back into shadow, and Sei returned her full attention to the scene unfolding below. Pike had finally managed to gather approximately 8 men into something vaguely resembling a defensive formation. They stood in a rough circle, weapons facing outward in all directions, attempting to present unified resistance against threats they could neither identify nor accurately locate. The mountain lion screamed again, noticeably closer this time. Close enough that Sei could hear the raw power behind the vocalization, the challenge and territorial warning woven into pure sound. Then she actually saw the animal, a massive shape, moving with liquid grace along a ledge, perhaps 50 feet above the clearing. The torchlight caught its eyes, creating twin reflections of amber fire that seemed to glow with their own internal light. The cat was enormous, easily exceeding 200 pounds of perfectly coordinated muscle and pure predatory intelligence. A mature male in absolute prime condition, undisputed lord of this particular territory, and clearly profoundly unhappy about the unprecedented invasion. One of Pike's men spotted the lion and fired instantly without waiting for any kind of authorization or coordinated response. The bullet struck stone somewhere near the massive cat's position, sending sharp fragments of rock spraying in multiple directions. The animal did not flee or even flinch. Instead, it crouched lower into a classic stalking posture, tail lashing with agitation, a deep sustained growl rolling from its chest like distant thunder-given voice. "Hold your fire!" Pike shouted desperately, but panic had completely infected what remained of his command structure. Two more men fired in rapid succession, their bullets going wild, ricocheting off stone surfaces in patterns of dangerous unpredictability. The mountain lion made its decision. It launched itself from the ledge in a flowing arc of perfectly controlled violence and terrible beauty. The cat did not attack the men directly, perhaps recognizing that such odds were unfavorable even for an apex predator. Instead, it landed heavily near the largest fire, scattering embers and burning branches, causing the defensive circle to break apart instantly as men stumbled backward in pure animal terror. The lion seized one of the 3 dead cattle in jaws powerful enough to crush bone and began dragging the massive carcass away from the clearing, demonstrating strength that seemed almost supernatural. More men fired now, creating a chaotic barrage of muzzle flashes that strobed the darkness in disorienting patterns. At least one bullet found its mark. The lion released the cow carcass and turned with a roar of pain and rage, blood clearly visible along its left flank, transforming the animal from opportunistic scavenger into genuinely dangerous threat. Tsei's heart contracted with unexpected grief. A wounded mountain lion was exponentially more dangerous than a healthy one, more unpredictable, more likely to attack out of pain-driven desperation rather than calculated hunting strategy. It would strike at the nearest target, whether that target represented actual threat or was simply convenient. She made a decision that would haunt her in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. Drawing one of the stolen rifles, she took extremely careful aim, compensating for distance and the animal's movement, and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the lion precisely behind its left shoulder, an instantly fatal shot placed with the hard-won expertise of someone who had hunted these magnificent animals throughout her entire adult life and understood their anatomy with scientific precision. The great cat stumbled forward 2 steps, attempted to roar, but produced only a wet, terrible cough. Its legs folded beneath it, and it collapsed onto one side legs, kicking weakly in involuntary spasms, then went completely still. The clearing fell into absolute silence except for harsh breathing and the soft crackle of scattered embers trying to reignite. Everyone stared at the dead lion, attempting to process what had just occurred in a sequence of events that had unfolded too quickly for rational thought. Pike recovered first, his survival instincts overriding his compromised mental state. "There!" he shouted with renewed energy, pointing directly toward the location of Tsei's muzzle flash. "She fired from there. Concentrate all fire on that exact position immediately." Bullets tore into the stone where Tsei had been positioned, but she was already moving with the fluid speed of long practice, flowing across the canyon wall's irregular surface like water finding paths of least resistance. She heard Nijoni calling to her in a harsh, urgent whisper from somewhere below, heard the deep rumble of carefully balanced rocks beginning to shift and tumble near the canyon entrance. The avalanche started deceptively small, just a few stones tumbling down the narrow passage with almost musical sounds. But those initial stones dislodged others in cascading progression, which dislodged still more, and within mere seconds a genuine river of rock was pouring down through the passage to completely block the only exit. The sound was tremendous and primordial, drowning out all shouting and sporadic gunfire, echoing and re-echoing, until it seemed the entire canyon was roaring its profound displeasure at this invasion. When the dust finally began to settle, The entrance was utterly and completely blocked. Multiple tons of stone filled the passage from ground level to 20 feet high, creating a barrier that would require days of coordinated labor to clear by hand, assuming the workers had proper tools and were not actively being harassed. Pike stared at the massive blockage, his face illuminated by wavering torchlight, and for the first time Tsei saw genuine existential fear completely replace his carefully cultivated confidence. He was effectively trapped in a hostile canyon with men rapidly losing their collective sanity, no horses for escape, severely limited supplies, and an enemy who seemed capable of materializing from stone itself. "We dig ourselves out," he said, but his voice utterly lacked conviction now. "We clear the passage stone by stone, and we leave this cursed place." "With what tools exactly?" the scarred Pinkerton agent demanded, his professional assessment cutting through Pike's desperate denial. "We have no proper shovels, no picks, no equipment designed for moving that volume of rock. Even if we improvise tools from what we have that represents days of brutal physical labor, we do not have sufficient food or water for multiple days." "There is water here," Pike said, gesturing vaguely toward the spring. "We have the spring." "The water is poisoned," someone else said, giving voice to the suspicion that had been growing in multiple minds. "That is why we are all seeing impossible things. She put something in the water supply, probably some kind of Apache plant medicine that drives men insane." The accusation hung in the air like physical weight, and Sei could observe men looking at their canteens with profound new suspicion, wondering exactly what they had been drinking, what was even now working systematically through their bodies and brains to distort reality. Pike's fragile control was visibly slipping away like sand through desperately clenched fingers. "Then we ration whatever water we still have that we know is safe. We post guards in rotating shifts. We survive through discipline and organization until someone realizes we are missing and sends help." "What help?" the scarred man pressed relentlessly, his voice hard with the realism of someone who had survived previous desperate situations by facing truth rather than embracing comforting lies. "No one in Copper Springs knows we are specifically here. No one is expecting us back on any particular schedule. No one is coming to rescue us." That statement was not entirely accurate. Say understood that when Pike's substantial force failed to return to Copper Springs within reasonable time, questions would inevitably be asked and some kind of search initiated. But those questions would take time to generate actual action. Days at minimum, possibly a week or more. Time was something Pike's increasingly unstable men simply did not have, not with their water supply fundamentally compromised and their collective mental states deteriorating by the hour. She moved carefully to yet another concealed position, this one much closer to the clearing, and began systematically gathering specific items she had cached at various locations the previous day. Mushrooms that glowed with faint bioluminescence in complete darkness, which she arranged in patterns that would seem supernatural or ritualistic to men whose grip on consensus reality was already badly compromised. Bones from ancient animals long extinct, carefully placed to suggest dark ceremonial significance that would feed directly into every superstition and fear white men harbored about Apache mysticism and spirit magic. Over the next several hours, as Pike's men tried with increasing desperation to maintain some minimal semblance of organization and military discipline, Tsei systematically transformed the clearing into an elaborate theater of sophisticated psychological warfare. She appeared briefly at the very edge of torchlight, just long enough for men to register a human shape, only to vanish completely when they looked directly at her location or attempted to aim weapons. She sang continuously in Apache, using words that spoke explicitly of death and vengeful spirits and the land's terrible revenge against those who violated sacred ground. She left carefully staged offerings that suggested powerful magic at work, playing methodically on every irrational fear and superstitious belief. By midnight, only 5 men remained even minimally functional enough to maintain coherent watch. The others had collapsed into various states of acute psychological crisis. Some wept uncontrollably like traumatized children. Some laughed with disturbing hysteria at things only they could perceive. One had curled into a tight fetal position and completely refused to speak, move, or acknowledge external reality in any way. Pike sat with his back pressed against the supply wagon, pistol gripped in both hands, eyes continuously scanning darkness that seemed to actively press inward from all sides with malevolent intent. He was still fighting, still grimly refusing to surrender. But Sei could read defeat in every line of his body, in the defeated slump of his shoulders, in the way his hands trembled despite his obvious efforts at control. She approached to within perhaps 30 feet of the firelight, close enough that he could see her clearly as a definite human figure rather than shadow or hallucination, but maintaining sufficient distance to retreat successfully before he could effectively aim and fire. "You are comprehensively beaten," she said in clear English, her voice carrying easily across the space separating them. "Your men are psychologically broken beyond any possibility of quick recovery. Your supplies are critically limited. Your exit is completely blocked. You have lost this confrontation in every way that matters." Pike raised his pistol with visible effort but did not immediately fire. "I could kill you right this moment. One shot center mass and this nightmare ends." "Perhaps you could," Sei acknowledged calmly. "Or perhaps you would miss in your current condition and my companion would immediately drop heavy rocks on your head from her position directly above you. Or perhaps the next mountain lion drawn by the smell of death would be less merciful than the one you have already killed. There are many theoretical possibilities, but they all ultimately end the same way. You leave this place or you die here. The law is absolutely on our side. We have complete legal authority granted by territorial courts. Your legal authority means precisely nothing to this land, nothing to the spirits who have guarded this place since before your ancestors ever conceived of crossing the ocean, nothing to a woman who made solemn promises to her dead son that she would protect his final resting place against any violation." Pike's hand trembled noticeably, the pistol lowering slightly despite his obvious intention to maintain threatening posture. "What exactly do you want from us? Leave immediately. Take your men and whatever supplies you can physically carry. Walk back to Copper Springs on foot. Tell Cornelius Ravenclaw directly that Shadow Valley is not for sale at any price. Tell him with absolute clarity that anyone who attempts to take it will face exactly what you faced here, only significantly worse because I will have learned from this experience." "And if we refuse to leave?" Sei smiled, though the expression contained no warmth whatsoever, only cold certainty. "Then this canyon keeps your bones permanently. In 100 years someone will stumble across your remains and wonder what particular fools died here trying to steal what was never theirs to take." She faded smoothly back into protective darkness before Pike could formulate any response, leaving him utterly alone with his shattered force and his completely demolished certainty about how this operation would conclude. By the time dawn began gradually lightening the eastern sky, Pike had made his inevitable decision. His men were in absolutely no condition to continue any kind of operation. More than half were actively hallucinating or catatonic. The others were physically and psychologically exhausted despite available water they now feared to drink, defeated by a night of relentless supernatural terror that had systematically dismantled every assumption they had brought with them. The remaining 8 men lay scattered across the canyon, some unconscious, others catatonic. A few had fled into the desert during the night's chaos. Only 12 remained capable of retreat. They gathered what supplies could be easily transported and began the brutal physical process of clearing just enough of the rockfall to create a passage barely wide enough for single-file human transit. The work took grueling hours of desperate labormen straining to move individual stones while simultaneously fighting off recurring visions and waves of vertigo that made even simple physical tasks extraordinarily difficult. Sei watched from her elevated position, Nijoni crouched silently beside her. The girl held one of the stolen rifles across her lap, though Sei seriously doubted she would actually fire the weapon, even if Pike's men attempted something desperate in their retreat. "They are actually leaving," Nijoni said wonderingly, as if she had not quite believed this outcome was genuinely possible. "They are truly leaving. For now," Sei replied, tempering the girl's premature celebration with hard realism. but they will certainly return eventually. Maybe not these specific men, but others. Cornelius Ravenclaw will not simply stop because one attempt failed spectacularly. Men like him interpret failure as temporary setback requiring modified approach, not as fundamental sign they should abandon their objectives. Then we do all of this again. Perhaps. Or perhaps we finally make use of Thomas's journal to pursue legal remedies. If we can successfully prove the deed is fraudulent, if we can force a proper federal investigation with honest officials, we might achieve victory without requiring additional violence. As the afternoon sun climbed toward its apex pike and 11 surviving men finally created an opening sufficient for escape, they departed without looking back, even once moving like defeated soldiers retreating from a battlefield that had systematically consumed their confidence and very nearly their lives and sanity. Tse waited until they had completely disappeared from view, their stumbling figures swallowed by heat, shimmer, and distance, before finally descending to the clearing. The devastation was remarkable in its comprehensiveness. Scattered supplies and abandoned equipment lay everywhere. Scorch marks darkened the ground where torches had fallen and been hastily extinguished. Discarded weapons and ammunition testified to the completeness of their psychological collapse. And the mountain lion lay where it had fallen, magnificent, even in death, its powerful body already beginning to attract the attention of scavengers who understood the gift of unexpected meat. Tse knelt slowly beside the great cat and placed her hand on its rapidly cooling flank, whispering words of profound apology in the Apache language her grandmother had taught her. This particular death weighed on her conscience with unexpected heaviness. The lion had been genuinely innocent, simply defending its territory exactly as she defended hers. It had died because men with guns had panicked, and because she had made the cold calculation that its life mattered less than preventing potential human casualties. "We should bury it with honors," Nijoni said quietly, recognizing the significance of the moment. Tse shook her head with finality. "No. We return its body to the land in the traditional way. We will take the claws and prominent teeth to honor its strength and preserve its spirit, but the body itself feeds whatever creatures need sustenance. This is the proper way, the way my grandmother taught me, the way Apache people have always treated animals who die in their territory." They worked steadily through the afternoon, cleaning the clearing of human debris, gathering abandoned supplies that might prove useful, attending to all the practical matters of continued survival. As evening gradually approached, Tse stood at the canyon entrance, looking outward across the vast desert that stretched toward distant purple mountains. Tomorrow she would need to make difficult decisions about what came next. Tomorrow she would need to develop concrete plans for addressing Cornelius Ravenclaw's inevitable retaliation. Tomorrow she would need to seriously consider whether Thomas's journal could provide the legal ammunition necessary to win through courts rather than continued violence. But tonight she simply stood in the place she had successfully defended, breathing air scented with sage and copper-laden dust, listening to the eternal silence of stone and sky that had witnessed this small human drama and would witness countless others before the mountains finally eroded to nothing. She had won a significant battle, but the war remained far from over. However, Tse Nalnish did not yet understand that the true test was still approaching, that Cornelius Ravenclaw himself was already riding toward Shadow Valley with enough men and explosive materials to ensure that if he could not have this land, absolutely no one would. 3 days later, just before dawn, Nijoni made a decision that would change everything. She woke her aunt while stars still dominated the sky. "I am going to Copper Springs," she announced. "I am taking Thomas's journal to the federal judge. This is the only way to truly end this without more death." Tse started to object, to argue that sending the girl into town was too dangerous, but she recognized the determination in her niece's eyes. This was not a child seeking permission. This was a woman announcing a decision already made. "If you do this," Tse said carefully, "they may arrest you. They may hurt you to punish me. Or they may listen to the evidence. Thomas said there is a federal Judge Carson in Copper Springs, a man Ravenclaw tried to bribe and failed. Perhaps he will care about truth." Before Tsei could respond further, Nijoni was gone, moving swiftly through pre-dawn darkness with the confidence of someone who had learned to trust her own capabilities. Tsei stood alone watching her niece disappear and felt fear she had not experienced even during the confrontation with Pike's men. She had been willing to risk her own life. Risking Nijoni's was infinitely more difficult. The sun rose, the morning aged into afternoon, and then just as Tsei was preparing to go after her niece, riders appeared on the horizon. Not Nijoni returning. Something far worse. Cornelius Ravenclaw rode at the head of 30 armed men with a wagon carrying wooden crates marked "Danger Explosives" in red letters. Tsei understood immediately. If Ravenclaw could not have Shadow Valley legally, he would destroy it utterly, making the land worthless to everyone. She prepared for her final stand, knowing this time there would be no clever tricks, no psychological warfare. This time would end in blood or victory, with no middle ground remaining. Ravenclaw's voice echoed across the canyon. "Mrs. Nalnish, I am giving you one final opportunity to leave voluntarily. If you refuse, I will collapse this entire canyon on top of you and everything you claim to protect." Tsei stepped into view, knife in hand, and spoke words that would be remembered by Apache people for generations. "Then you will die trying, and your bones will rest here beside mine, and in 100 years no one will remember your name or why you thought copper mattered more than honor." The final confrontation had begun. The sun climbed higher as Cornelius Ravenclaw's men began unloading wooden crates from the wagon. Tsei watched from her concealed position, counting the explosives with cold calculation. Enough dynamite to collapse half the canyon. She had perhaps an hour before they finished setting charges. An hour before Shadow Valley became a tomb for everyone in it, including herself. Then movement at the canyon entrance. A single figure on horseback moving with desperate speed. Nijoni. The girl rode straight through Ravenclaw's perimeter, waving a document above her head. "Stop!" she shouted in English. "Federal order. You must stop immediately." Cornelius turned amused rather than alarmed. He was a large man, perhaps 60, with silver hair and eyes like winter frost. "And who might you be, girl?" "I am Nijoni Redbird. I have just come from Federal Judge Carson in Copper Springs. This is a cease and desist order. Your deed is fraudulent. Victorio Chato was dead when that signature was made. You have no legal claim to this land." She thrust the paper toward him. Cornelius took it, read it slowly, then smiled. Not the reaction Nijoni had expected. "Interesting," he said, handing the document back. "Unfortunately, I don't particularly care what Judge Carson thinks. By the time federal authorities arrive to enforce this order, there will be nothing left to dispute. No canyon, no graves, no evidence. Just a collapsed hole in the ground too dangerous to excavate." He gestured to his men. "Continue setting charges. We detonate in 30 minutes. Nijoni's face drained of color. "You cannot. People will know what you did." "Will they? Who will tell them you—" Cornelius drew his pistol casually. "I think not." The shot that should have killed Nijoni never came. Instead, Cornelius stumbled forward, a knife handle protruding from his shoulder. Tsei had thrown from 60 feet away, the blade bearing itself to the hilt. Chaos erupted. Ravenclaw's men scattered, searching for the source of the attack. Cornelius tore the knife from his flesh with a roar of pain and rage. "Find her," he snarled, "and bring me that girl." But Nijoni was already riding back toward Tsei's position, the horse galloping with wild-eyed panic. 2 of Ravenclaw's men pursued on foot, raising rifles. Tsei dropped both men with stones thrown with lethal precision, 1 strike to each temple. They fell without firing a shot. "Aunt Tsei," Nijoni gasped as she reached the hidden ledge. "The charges. He is going to destroy everything." "I know." Tsei's voice was eerily calm. "How long?" He said 30 minutes, maybe 20 now. Tsei looked toward the main spring, where she could see men working around the natural reservoir that fed the entire canyon's water system. If they collapsed that chamber, the explosion would trigger a chain reaction. Everything would come down. "You need to leave," Tsei said. "Right now. Ride out through the eastern pass. Do not stop. Do not look back." What about you? I am going to stop them. You cannot. There are too many. They will kill you. Sei gripped her niece's shoulders, looking into eyes that reflected her own determination. Listen to me. If I do nothing, we all die. If I stop the detonation, only I die. That is a trade worth making. No, I will not lose you too. You will not lose me. Sei pressed something into Nijoni's hand, the beaded bracelet that had belonged to Mangas. As long as you live, as long as you remember, I am not gone. Now ride. Tell Thomas what happened. Tell Judge Carson. Make sure Shadow Valley is protected by more than one woman's knife. Before Nijoni could protest further, Tsei slapped the horse's flank hard. The animal bolted, carrying the girl away despite her attempts to rein in. Tsei watched until her niece disappeared around the canyon bend. Then she turned toward the spring where Cornelius Ravenclaw stood, directing his men, blood-staining his expensive shirt. She had perhaps 15 minutes. The descent was faster than caution would normally allow, her feet finding holds through muscle memory rather than conscious thought. She moved like water flowing downhill, inevitable and silent. She reached the spring chamber as two men were connecting wires to the final charge. They never saw her coming. The first went down with her knife across his hamstrings, the second with a blow to the base of his skull. Both would live, but neither would walk or fight today. Cornelius heard the commotion and turned his pistol already drawn. You. Me. Tsei confirmed, knife in one hand, wire cutters taken from the fallen men in the other. You know this is pointless. Even if you stop this, I will return. I will always return. Men like me do not stop. Men like you die. Tsei moved toward the wires. Cornelius fired. The bullet struck her left shoulder, spinning her partially around. She did not fall, did not even cry out, just turned back to face him, blood spreading across her buckskin shirt. How are you still standing? Cornelius's voice carried genuine disbelief. Because I have been dying for 3 years. One more wound changes nothing. She lunged forward, not toward him but toward the wires. Cornelius fired again, the bullet grazing her ribs. Still she moved, cutting the first wire, then the second. Cornelius closed the distance, striking her across the face with his pistol. Tsei tasted blood, felt teeth loosen. She cut the third wire. "Stop!" Cornelius roared, grabbing her wounded shoulder. The pain was white-hot, blinding. Tsei drove her knife backward, feeling it sink into flesh. Cornelius gasped, released her. She cut the fourth wire. Only one remained. Cornelius, bleeding from a wound in his side, raised his pistol one final time. "You stubborn savage! Die already!" "After you." Tsei threw herself forward as he fired. The bullet meant for her heart struck her lung instead. But her momentum carried her into him, and together they fell onto the remaining wire, her knife finding his chest as they collapsed. The blade went deep, puncturing his heart. Cornelius's eyes went wide with shock, then empty. Tsei lay beside him, her own blood pooling with his. With failing strength she reached for the wire cutters. Her fingers felt distant, disconnected, but she closed them around the handles, squeezed. The wire parted. The charges were dead. Shadow Valley was safe. Tsei let the cutters fall from her hand. Pain was fading now, replaced by a curious lightness. She could hear water flowing in the spring, eternal and clean. Could smell sage on the wind that somehow reached even here. Footsteps approached. Federal marshals, perhaps, or Ravenclaw's remaining men fleeing. It did not matter. She thought of Naichi, of Daklugie. Soon she would see them again. Soon she could tell her son that his mother had kept her promise. Her eyes closed. The darkness was not frightening. It was simply a return to the earth that had always held her. Tsei Nalnish, last guardian of Shadow Valley, died as she had lived, defending sacred ground with nothing but a knife and absolute certainty. Above, the sun continued its arc across an indifferent sky. The canyon would remain, the graves would stay undisturbed, and the land would remember. Epilogue. 10 years later. Nijoni Garrett stood on the ridge above Shadow Valley, her daughter's small hand in hers. The girl was 5 years old, with her grandfather Mangus's dark eyes and her father Thomas's gentle smile. "Tell me again about Aunt Tseyi," the child said. Nijoni knelt beside her daughter, looking out across the canyon that had become the first federally protected Apache heritage site. The wickiup still stood where Tseyi had built it, preserved now as a memorial. "Your great-aunt was the strongest woman I ever knew," Nijoni began. "She hunted mountain lions with only a knife. She defended this land against 30 armed men. And when she died protecting something bigger than herself. Was she scared? No, little one, she was never scared, because she understood that some things matter more than staying alive, like keeping promises to those we love, like protecting places where our ancestors rest, like making sure future generations, children like you, know who they are and where they come from." The girl looked at the valley below, at the spring that still ran clear at the stone markers that showed where Tseyi and her family lay. "Will you tell my children about her?" "Yes, and you will tell your children, and they will tell theirs. That is how Aunt Tseyi lives forever, not in stone or monuments, but in the stories we carry and the promises we keep." They sat together in comfortable silence as the sun set over Shadow Valley, painting the canyon walls in shades of amber and rose, just as it had on the day Tseyi Nalnish was born, and on the day she died, and on all the days between. The land remembered, and that was enough.